The galaxy led human warfare, because no species could survive it. Part 1. The first contact war that lasted 9 days. The message came in the form of light. A tight beam of structured signal, bounced off 3 relay points and aimed directly at Earth's deep space listening array near Jupiter. It arrived on a cold morning in February 2387, and the technicians on duty almost missed it because it looked at first like background noise. Then the pattern inside the noise became clear, and one of the junior operators put down her coffee and said very quietly, "That is a language." It took 11 days to decode. When the translation came through, it was passed up the chain so fast that the analyst who finished it did not even have time to put on his jacket before 2 men in dark coats were at his door. The message was from the Vreth Collective. It said in very formal and ceremonial language that the Vreth considered the Outer Rim territory beyond the Kali's belt to be their sovereign expansion zone. It said that humanity had placed 3 survey stations inside that zone. It said that this was an act of aggression under galactic law. And it said with great ceremony and what seemed to be genuine politeness that the Vreth were hereby declaring a formal state of war. There was a specific date given for when hostilities would begin. It was 30 days away. There were rules listed. There were boundaries described. There was a suggested location for what the message called the opening engagement, a kind of agreed upon first battle that would set the tone for negotiations. The people who read this message passed it to their commanders. Their commanders passed it to their generals. Their generals passed it to the people who make decisions that the history books remember. Commander Leonhardt read the message 3 times at his desk in the Earth Defense Fleet headquarters in orbit above North America. He was a tall man with a quiet face and the kind of eyes that made junior officers uncomfortable because they were always calculating something. He had spent 22 years in space warfare. He had studied every recorded conflict between spacefaring species that humanity had managed to collect data on since first contact became a real possibility. He understood what the Vreth message was saying, and he also understood what it was not saying. It was not saying, "We expect you to do something we have never seen before." Leon called his senior staff into the briefing room. He did not talk about the opening ceremony. He did not talk about the suggested battle location. He pulled up a star map and started marking Vreth positions, their supply depots, their communication relays, their staging points along the outer rim. He had been tracking Vreth movement for 8 months quietly as a background project. His staff had thought it was academic. It was not academic. "They gave us 30 days, he said. "We will not need 30 days. The plan he laid out over the next 6 hours was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that would look good in a documentary. It was the kind of plan that worked. 3 simultaneous strikes across different sectors. Hit the supply lines first so the frontline forces have no fuel and no ammunition resupply. Hit the communication relay second so the hive mind gets fragmented and the different parts of the Vreth fleet cannot coordinate. Hit the staging points third, hard and fast before they can reorganize. All of it within 48 hours of the declared start date." His logistics officer pointed out that they had not yet formally responded to. The declaration. Leon looked at her for a moment. Responding to the declaration is. Responding to the declaration, he said. On the other side of the galaxy, the Vreth Collective processed the war declaration with the calm efficiency of a species that had done this many times. They had fought 11 wars in their history. They had won 9 of them. The 2 they lost had ended in negotiated settlements that were honestly not so bad. War for the Vreth was a structured process. It had rules because rules made it manageable. It had ceremonies because ceremonies signaled intent, and signaling intent prevented misunderstandings. It had agreed upon boundaries because boundaries kept conflicts from becoming catastrophes. They had no idea what was coming. The first strike hit before the ceremonial start date by 4 hours. This alone was so far outside the expected behavior of any known species that the Vreth commanders initially assumed it was a malfunction in their own sensors. By the time they understood it was real, 2 of their 3 main supply depots, the region, were already gone. The communication relay at Kali's Point went dark 11 minutes later. The hive mind, which was used to operating as a smooth and connected whole, began to feel like a brain trying to think with parts of itself missing. Captain Dana Ortiz was on the ground by day 3. She led a unit of 40 soldiers onto the 3rd moon of Vreth-held Kali's 7. Place with thin air, temperature swings that would kill an unprotected human. Minutes, and terrain that was basically a long series of sharp rocks separated by more sharp rocks. The mission was to take and hold the communication tower on the moon's northern ridge, which was the last working relay the Vreth had in that sector. Dana was from El Paso. She had grown up in heat. Cold was something she had made a decision about a long time ago, which was that it was not going to stop her. Her unit moved in low-oxygen suits through a valley that the Vreth defenders had assumed was impassable. The Vreth were not wrong exactly. It was nearly impassable. Dana's unit passed through it anyway, slowly, painfully, over the course of 9 hours, and they took the tower from behind while the Vreth were still watching the front. They were cut off from orbital support. For 60 hours after that, a Vreth counterattack came on the 2nd day, larger than expected. Dana's unit was low on ammunition. They improvised. One of her soldiers, a young man named Kyle from somewhere in Ohio, figured out that Vreth portable shields ran on a frequency that human signal jammers could disrupt. He had never been trained for this. He worked it out on a notepad while sitting behind a rock with enemy fire going overhead. The shields went down. The counterattack failed. On day 9, the Vreth sent a message. It did not use the formal war-ending ceremony. There was no ceremony left in them. It was a short message, and it said simply that they wished to discuss terms. Leon received the message in orbit. He sent back a reply within the hour. The reply was also short. It said that Earth was willing to talk, and that the survey stations would remain where they were. The war ended far away in the great debating chambers of the Galactic Senate. Observers who had been watching through remote sensor networks sat in complete silence for a long time after the final reports came in. A war that should have lasted months, maybe years, with slow territorial exchanges and careful negotiations, had ended in 9 days. One side had not followed a single agreed convention. One side had attacked before the ceremony, hit targets that were not on the approved list, fought in terrain that was supposed to be neutral ground, and improvised tactics that no war doctrine in the known galaxy had anticipated. One senior senator, an old Sanari with 4 decades of diplomatic experience, turned to her aide and asked for the full report on human military history. The aide came back 3 days later, looking like she had not slept. She placed a data chip on the senator's desk and said, "You are going to want to read this alone." The senator did. She called an emergency session the following morning. The galaxy-led human warfare, because no species could survive it. Part to the dossier. The building where the Galactic Senate kept its most sensitive documents was very old and very quiet. It sat on the second continent of Senara Prime, carved into the side of a mountain that had not seen a natural disaster in 800 years, which was more or less when the Senari had decided it was a good place to store things they did not want destroyed. The halls inside were cool and dim, and the archivists who worked there spoke in low voices out of habit, even when there was no one else around to disturb. Overseer Qual had worked in this building for 31 years. She was old even by Senari standards, which meant she was old by any standard. She had seen empires apply for Senate membership. She had watched species go through there clumsy, painful first contacts and come out the other side. She had filed the paperwork when the Vreth joined. She had filed the paperwork when 12 other species joined. She had a calm, steady way of looking at problems that her younger colleagues sometimes mistook for indifference. It was not indifference. It was the particular steadiness of someone who had seen enough things go wrong to know that panicking never helped. She was not calm when she started reading the human dossier. The project had begun quietly 6 months after the Vreth War ended. The Senate's Intelligence Directorate had assigned a team of 42 analysts drawn from 9 different species, chosen for their objectivity and their experience, to compile a complete record of human conflict from the earliest available historical evidence to the present day. The goal was simple: understand what had just happened, understand who exactly humanity was. The analysts worked in rotating shifts of 4 hours each. This was not a schedule chosen for efficiency. It was a schedule chosen because 4 hours was approximately how long any analyst could read before they needed to stop and do something else for a while. Anything else. Some of them took walks. Some of them sat in the building's small garden and looked at the mountain. One Dolari analyst, a careful and experienced woman named Path, began keeping a private journal during her off hours. She later destroyed it. She said when asked that she did not want anyone else to read what she had written. The dossier, when complete, was 112,000 pages long. Qual read the summary first. Then she read 300 randomly selected pages from the main document. Then she sat at her desk for a long time without doing anything. Then she called her senior staff and told them to clear the next 2 weeks. What the dossier described was not what anyone had expected. Other species had fought wars. Every species in the Senate had fought wars at some point. War was not the shocking part. The shocking part was the shape of it, the way it kept going. The way humans kept finding new methods, new tools, new reasons, new ways to survive conflicts that should have broken them and keep going afterward, as if the breaking had only made them harder. There was a section in the dossier on a conflict called the Second World War. It lasted 6 years and involved most of the major political powers on Earth at the time. The casualties were in the tens of millions. When it ended, humanity did not rest. Within 4 years, they were already in another conflict, this one defined by the tension between two massive power blocks, each holding weapons capable of ending all life on the planet. They held those weapons for 40 years without using them. This was considered by human historians to be a success path. The Dolari analyst had written a note in the margin of this section of the dossier. Qual found it when she went through the annotated draft. The note said, "They the weapons that could kill everything, and then they chose not to use them, and they called this piece." There was a section on what humans called the laws of war. These were rules that human civilizations had agreed upon over centuries, rules about how to treat prisoners, about what weapons were acceptable, about how to protect civilians. The section was thorough and in places almost hopeful. Then came the subsection immediately following it, which cataloged every documented case of those rules being broken, bent, technically observed while being practically violated, and argued about in courts for decades afterward. One of the Senari analysts had left a comment in this section. It said they invented the rules and also invented every possible way around the rules. We are not sure whether this is sophisticated or terrifying. Another analyst from a species called the Shari, who were known for being very literal, had replied to the comment, "It is both." Qual brought the dossier to a closed session of the 6th Senior Senate. Species. She placed a physical copy on the table, a gesture that was unusual enough that everyone in the room noticed it immediately. Physical documents meant she wanted them to feel the weight of it. She spoke for 20 minutes. She did not use emotional language. She laid out the facts the way a doctor lays out a diagnosis, clearly, carefully, without flinching. Humanity had been in a state of continuous or near continuous conflict for approximately 10,000 years. They had developed weapons capable of planetary destruction and chosen collectively not to use them on their own world, but the choice had been close. Several times, they had fought each other across every continent, every ocean, every climate, every terrain type their planet offered. They had fought in conditions that should have been impossible, and they had adapted until the conditions were merely very difficult. They had lost wars and come back to win them. They had been occupied, colonized, and crushed, and they had always eventually gotten back up. We have welcomed into this galaxy, Qual said, a species that has been at war with itself continuously for approximately 10,000 years. They have not stopped. They have simply paused. The room was quiet for a while. A young Senari analyst named Vel, who had been permitted to attend as an observer, raised the question that everyone was thinking. What do they do, she asked, when they are not at war? Qual looked at her for a moment. They prepare, she said. There was more quiet. The representative from the Dolari spoke. Next, he was a careful, diplomatic man who had spent 40 years finding middle ground between species that hated each other. And he looked at this moment like someone who was not sure there was a middle ground to find. He asked what the Senate's options were. Quayle listed them. Isolation was not realistic. Humanity was already integrated into several trade networks and had allies among 3 minor species. Direct confrontation was, she said, simply not a discussion she was willing to have. Negotiation was possible but required something to negotiate about. What remained, she said, was legislation. It was Vell who said what everyone else was thinking but had not yet put into words. If we pass a law restricting human warfare, she said, and they decide not to follow it, what do we do? No one answered. The session ended 3 hours later without a formal resolution. But when the delegates left, they all knew what was coming. Quayle stayed behind alone in the room for a while, looking at the physical copy of the dossier on the table. She did not open it again. She already knew what was in it. She was thinking instead about a different question, one that the dossier had raised but not answered. Every species in that room had at some in their history been afraid of something and chosen to fight it. Every species had a story of a moment when survival felt impossible and they found a way through anyway. The question the dossier raised, quietly in the spaces between its 100,000 pages of data and analysis and annotated horror, was this: what happens to a species that has done that not once, not a dozen times, but continuously for 10,000 years and has never, not once, been completely defeated? Quayle picked up her coat. She turned off the light. She went home and did not sleep well. The legislation began drafting the following week. The Galaxutrid human warfare, because no species could survive it. Part 3. The Accord of Calith Prime. The Senate floor on the morning of the first reading was more crowded than it had been in 20 years. Species who sent observers rather than full delegates had sent full delegates. Species who usually watch sessions through remote relay had sent someone. Person. Even the Marin, an ancient and quiet people who attended perhaps 3 sessions a year and almost never spoke, had sent their elder representative, who sat in the far corner of the upper gallery and said nothing and missed nothing. Ambassador Preth of the Delari stood at the central podium. He was a small figure by galactic standards, dressed in the dark formal wear of his people, and he had a reputation for choosing words the way surgeon chooses instruments, with precision, with purpose, and without waste. He had drafted the legislation being introduced today along with a team of 14 other diplomats, and they had gone through 41 versions before agreeing on the language. The full title of the legislation was the Galactic Convention on the Prohibition of Human Military Engagement Beyond Sol Jurisdiction. Everyone called it the Human Accord. Preth began by saying clearly that the accord was not about punishment. He said this twice in 2 different ways because he knew that how a thing was framed in its opening moments was often how it was remembered forever, and he did not want this remembered as an act of hostility. The accord, he said, was about stability. It was about the preservation of the galactic order that the Senate had spent 8 centuries building. It was about the recognition that some forces, when released without boundary, created consequences that went far beyond the original conflict. He did not say, "We are afraid of them." He did not need to. The debate that followed lasted 4 months. Preth had expected 3. The extra month came from the number of species that wanted to speak, not just the major powers but the smaller members, the ones who usually stayed quiet and let the big voices fill the room. A delegate from the Yori spent 2 days presenting statistical models showing the projected casualty rates of any conflict involving human forces versus any other known military. The numbers were not close. A Vreth representative, still carrying a particular kind of careful stillness that had not left their people since the 9-day war, gave a testimony that lasted 40 minutes and was in parts very hard to listen to. They fought in places we considered impassable, the Vreth representative said. They used our own equipment against us. After we had lost it, they were cut off, isolated, outnumbered in certain sectors, and they did not stop. We kept waiting for the point where they would decide that continuing was not worth it. That point did not come. We do not believe that point exists. Humanity's delegation sat through all of it. Ambassador Calvin Reyes had been Earth's Senate representative for 12 years. Before that, he had spent 8 years in naval intelligence, which was not the kind of job that appeared in detail on his official biography, but which had given him a very particular way of paying attention to rooms, who was speaking, who was not speaking, what the space between words contained. He was from Colorado, spoke 4 languages, and had a habit of taking notes by hand in a small paper notebook that he carried everywhere. Several alien delegates had commented on the notebook over the years. Something about a human writing things by hand in a room full of digital recording systems made people uneasy in a way they could not quite explain. Calvin listened to 4 months of debate about his species and wrote things in his notebook and was, outwardly, completely calm. The arguments against the accord came from 3 directions. Some species argued it was discriminatory, that no other species had been subjected to military restrictions of this kind, and that the precedent was dangerous. Some argued it was unenforceable, that a species willing and able to fight as humans fought would not be stopped by a document. And a small but vocal group argued that it was simply unnecessary, that humanity had shown in the years since first contact a genuine willingness to engage diplomatically and should be given the benefit of the doubt. Calvin did not speak during any of these sessions. He was not required to until the final week of debate, when each major delegation was given the floor for a response. When his turn came, he walked to the central podium, put his notebook on the surface in front of him, and stood quietly for a moment before he began. He spoke for 11 minutes. He said that Earth had read and considered the full text of the accord. He said that humanity understood the Senate's concerns and did not dismiss them. He said that humans had, in their own history, passed many laws and agreements about the conduct of conflict, and that they understood better than most how difficult it was to put limits on something that by its nature resisted limits. He said that Earth valued its place in the galactic community and valued the relationships it had built with other species in the years since first contact. Then he paused. He said that he hoped in return the Senate had given careful thought to the nature of agreements. Agreements worked, he said, when all parties believed they were made in good faith and would be honored in good faith. Agreements failed when one party felt the agreement had been written not as a mutual arrangement but as a way of managing them, of keeping them contained. He said that Earth would look at the intent behind the accord as carefully as it looked at the text. He said that he hoped the intent was what it had been described as: stability, not fear, not control. Stability. He picked up his notebook. "We will sign," he said. "We hope that means what it means." He smiled when he said it. It was a calm, genuine, perfectly pleasant smile. The Senari transcriptionist assigned to record the session wrote in the diplomatic record the following note. Beside that moment, expression category: unclassifiable. The accord passed by a vote of 73 to 12. Humanity signed it at a formal ceremony on Caliph Prime, the neutral station that gave the legislation its name. Calvin signed on behalf of Earth with the same pen he used in his notebook, which was a plain black pen that he had owned for 9 years. Several delegates noticed this. No one said anything about it. The galaxy collectively breathed out. There were celebrations in some Senate chambers. There were quiet private sighs of relief in many government buildings. Across many worlds, the idea that there was now a legal framework, a boundary around the thing that had frightened everyone felt, for a moment, like enough. Like the problem was managed. That feeling lasted about 4 years. Calvin returned to his office after the signing ceremony and sat down at his desk. His aide, a young woman named Lucy, who had been working with him for 2 years and had learned to read his silences very well, brought him coffee and waited. He opened his notebook to a new page. "They think it's over," he said. Lucy waited. "It's not over," he said. "It's just a new situation." He wrote something on the page, closed the notebook, and drank his coffee. Lucy never asked what he had written. She had learned that some things Calvin wrote were for him and not for anyone else. She went back to her desk and looked at the celebration feeds coming in from across the Senate network, all the relief and the congratulations and the sense of a problem solved. She thought about what Calvin had said. She was not sure it was a problem that could be solved. She was not even sure it was a problem. Sometimes she thought a thing was just a thing, a fact of the universe that you learn to live around the way you learn to live around a star that was very bright and very hot and gave you light and warmth and would burn you to nothing if you got too close. Outside, the galaxy celebrated. Inside, Calvin Reyes turned to the next page in his notebook and kept writing. The galaxy led human warfare because no species could survive it. Part 4. The Kareth Incident. The colony ship CSF Aldrin left Earth's orbital station on a Tuesday. It carried 412 people. Families mostly. Couples who had spent years on waiting lists for charter slots on new worlds. Children who had grown up hearing their parents talk about open land and clean air and a sky that was not crowded with city light. 2 doctors, 1 school teacher, a man named Gary who had spent 30 years as a mechanic and wanted, more than anything, to grow things in soil he could call his own. They were not soldiers. They were not explorers in any dramatic sense. They were people who wanted a quieter Life, and they had found one on paper, on a newly chartered world in a system. 3 months of travel from Earth. They never arrived. The message that reached Earth's relay network 6 weeks after the Aldrin's departure was brief and came from a Karath military vessel. It said that the Annie's cluster was Karath sovereign territory. It said that any human vessel entering the cluster without Karath authorization would be treated as an enemy combatant. It said that the CSF Aldrin had entered Karath space and had been destroyed. Accordingly, it said there were no survivors. At the end of the message, the Karath Military Council added one more line. It said that they were aware of the Human Accord. It said that humanity's military was legally restricted from engaging outside sole jurisdiction. And it said in language that was careful and deliberate and designed to be understood exactly as it was written, that the Karath considered this permanent and satisfactory situation. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, Fleet Admiral Grace Navarro had a plan on the president's desk. Grace was 53 years old and had the kind of face that gave nothing away. She had short gray hair and a habit of speaking slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she had long ago decided that words said at the right pace landed harder than words said fast. She was known among her staff for the small vegetable garden outside her office window, tomatoes and green peppers, which she tended herself in the early mornings before the building filled up. She was also the person who had designed the tactical doctrine that ended the Vreth War in 9 days, though her name did not appear in any public document connected to that operation. Grace had been watching the Karath for 2 years. Not officially. Officially, her office had no mandate in the Annie's cluster, but Grace had a way of finding things interesting that other people found too far away to worry about, and she had been quietly collecting data on Karath military movements, supply patterns, and communication infrastructure the way some people collect stamps, methodically without hurry, because she believed that the moment you needed information was never the moment you had time to gather it. The plan she brought to the president had 3 parts. The first part was a formal diplomatic protest filed through the Galactic Senate. It was loud. It named the Aldrin specifically. It listed the names of every person on board. It described the attack in detail and called for a Senate investigation. This part was designed to run in every news network across the galaxy for weeks. Grace wanted the Karath name attached to 412 dead civilians on every screen in known space. She wanted the Karath to feel the weight of what they had done in every diplomatic meeting, every trade discussion, every Senate session for years to come. The second part was a request sent to 3 allied species, the Yori, the Senari, and a small but well-connected species called the Flen, for what Grace described as a routine intelligence sharing exercise. She asked for navigational data on shipping lanes in and around the Annie's cluster. She asked for records of Karath communication frequencies over the last 18 months. She asked for structural schematics of 3 Karath deep space stations, which she described as relevant to a safety assessment she was conducting. Her counterparts in those 3 species asked no follow-up questions because they had all in their own ways read the human dossier, and they had all understood that the best thing to do, when Grace Navarro asked you for something and described it as routine, was to give it to her. The third part of the plan was not written down anywhere. Grace explained it verbally once to 3 people. Those 3 people explained their portions to the people who needed to know also verbally. Nothing went into any system that could be retrieved, searched, or subpoenaed. Grace had learned this approach from a history she had spent a great deal of time reading, a history full of operations that went wrong not because of bad planning but because of paperwork. 6 weeks after the Aldrin message reached Earth, the Karath fleet responsible for the attack ceased to exist. It did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in pieces over 11 days in ways that each looked individually like coincidence or equipment failure or very bad luck. A fuel depot in the outer Annie's cluster suffered a catastrophic pressure failure. A communication relay that the Karath fleet depended on went silent, and when technicians arrived to investigate, they found nothing wrong with the hardware. It had simply stopped receiving signals that, it turned out, had been redirected somewhere else for the past month. 3 Karath warships that had participated in the Aldrin attack experienced simultaneous navigation system failures during a routine patrol and drifted into a debris field. Debris field had not been on their charts because their charts, unknown to them, had been quietly out of date for several weeks. The Karath Military Council met in emergency session. Their intelligence services worked around the clock. They could not find a single clear line connecting any of these events to Earth. What they found instead were edges, suggestions, the feeling of a pattern that dissolved every time they looked directly at it. It was like trying to hold smoke. One Karath intelligence officer filed a report saying she believed all of these events were connected and that the connecting thread was human. Her supervisor read the report and filed it in a category that translated roughly as possible but unprovable. That category was where the report stayed. The only human vessel found anywhere near the Annie's cluster during this period was a small science craft called the GES Heron, registered as a civilian survey ship, which was discovered drifting near the cluster border with engine failure. It was broadcasting a polite distress signal. A Karath patrol vessel investigated and found 4 humans on board, a pilot, 2 scientists, and a technician who were apologetic about their navigation error and very grateful for the assistance. The patrol vessel towed the Heron to a nearby station, accepted the humans' thanks, and watched them depart. None of the 4 people on the Heron had military designations in any database the Karath could access. The Karath filed a formal protest with the Galactic Senate alleging that Earth had violated the Human Accord. The Senate's investigation committee reviewed the available evidence for 4 months. They found that the loss of the Karath fleet was consistent with a series of unrelated equipment failures and navigational accidents. They found no evidence of human military action. They closed the investigation. 2 weeks after the investigation closed, Ambassador Calvin Ray sent a formal note of condolence to the Karath High Council. It expressed Earth's sympathy for the tragic loss of Karath personnel in what appeared to have been a series of terrible accidents. It expressed hope that the Karath would implement better safety standards going forward. It expressed confidence that the relationship between the Carith and the broader galactic community would continue to grow in a positive direction. The note was 3 paragraphs long. Every sentence was correct. Every word was precisely chosen. There was nothing in it that could be called a threat. There was nothing in it that could be called anything other than a diplomatic expression of sympathy. The Carith High Council read it together in their chamber. When they were done, no one spoke for a very long time. They framed it. They hung it in the Carith War Museum, within the decade, in a room that contained their most significant historical documents. The label beside it, written by the museum's chief archivist after a long period of careful thought, said simply, "The most frightening document in our history." In the Senate, quietly, in conversations that did not appear in official records, certain delegates began to have a different kind of discussion, not about how to contain humanity, about something else entirely, something that had been there all along. In the dossier, in the 9-Day War, in the Carith incident, in every moment since first contact, something that kept getting overlooked because everyone was so focused on what humans could do to their enemies. No one had stopped to think clearly about what humans could do for their friends, the Galaxy-led human warfare, because no species could survive it. Part 5. The Galaxy votes again. Elder Sohu had not spoken in the Senate chamber in 6 years. This was not unusual for the Marin. They were an old people, old in the way that certain mountains are old in the way that deep water is old, and they had learned over 8 centuries of Senate membership that words spoken rarely carry more weight than words spoken. Often, the Marin delegate's chair in the upper gallery was always occupied. Elder Sohu, or her predecessor, or the one before that, had been present for nearly every significant session in living memory. They watched. They listened. They took no sides in public, made no alliances that anyone could name, and every few years, when they finally spoke, the room went very quiet. On the morning of the new motion, Sohu rose from her chair. The room went quiet. She was small and very still, the way deep water is still, and she spoke in her own language through the translation system in a voice that was low and unhurried. She said that she had something to say about the human accord. She said it would not take long. It took 4 minutes. She began by saying that the Senate had made an error. She said this plainly, without apology, because she was old enough not to waste time on softening things that did not need to be softened. The error, she said, was not a moral one. The accord had not been written out of malice. The error was logical. The Senate had looked at humanity and asked the wrong question. The question the Senate had asked was, how do we stop them from fighting us? The question the Senate should have asked was, what happens to a species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to fight and survives every single time? She paused to let that sit. Then she asked the Senate to look at a set of numbers her research team had compiled. She did not read the numbers aloud. They appeared on the chamber's display screens, quiet rows of data that several delegates leaned forward to read and then sat back in their chairs with particular expressions on their faces. In the 14 years since first contact, humanity had signed 41 diplomatic agreements with species who were not Senate members, smaller civilizations. Younger ones, people who the Senate's formal structures had not yet reached. These agreements covered trade, navigation rights, medical exchange, and, in several cases, protection. Humanity had built 11 deep space rescue stations positioned at intervals across major travel corridors. The stations were free to any vessel. Distress regardless of species, regardless of politics. They asked for nothing in return. Humanity had shared agricultural technology with 4 pre-spaceflight civilizations on worlds that were struggling with food production. They had sent teachers. They had sent engineers. They had sent, in 2 cases, doctors who had spent years working in difficult conditions to help populations that had no way to repay them and had not been asked to. And then the last line of SO's data, the one that made the chamber very still. In the 14 years since first contact, human forces had intervened 3 times to stop what independent observers had classified as genocide, mass killing of civilian populations on worlds that the Senate had formally designated as outside its jurisdiction. Worlds where the Senate had reviewed the situation, discussed it, and concluded that the political complexity made direct action inadvisable. In all 3 cases, the killing had stopped after human intervention. In all 3 cases, humanity had taken no territory, accepted no payment, and made no public announcement. The interventions had appeared in the Senate's intelligence reports as footnotes. So who let the room sit with this for a moment? Then she introduced the motion. It was simple. Repeal the Human Accord. Replace it with a formal mutual defense partnership. Let humanity fight, she said, but let them fight for all of us. We looked at what they could do to their enemies, she said. We forgot to look at what they do for the people they consider their own. We should look at that more carefully. We should ask ourselves who they consider their own. She sat down. The debate that followed lasted 8 months. Colonel Pete Dawson sat through all of it. Pete was Earth's military liaison to the Senate, a position that had been created quietly after the Karif incident as a way of having someone present who could answer technical questions about human military capacity without those questions having to go through Ambassador Calvin Reyes, who had a way of answering questions that left people feeling both informed and unsettled. Pete was 29 years old, from a small town in Georgia, and looked younger than he was in a way that had caused problems. Exactly once early in his posting, when a senior Delari delegate had addressed him as junior staff, Pete had handled this with good humor and no visible irritation, and the delegate had quietly revised his assessment over the following weeks. Pete had a habit. Every night of the debate sessions, when the chamber cleared and the security staff settled in for the long quiet hours, he brought coffee. Not for himself, though he drank some. He brought it for the staff. The Senari archivist who worked the night shift and was always cold. The 2 Yori guards who stood at the East Corridor and had, he had noticed it, his first week, no access to the building's food service during their shift. The young Delari aide who was always the last to leave and always looked like she had been awake for too long. He learned their names. He learned how they took their coffee, or what they preferred if they did not drink coffee. He asked about their families in the careful, genuine way of someone who actually wanted to know. Within 3 months, Pete Dawson had approximately 200 friends in a building full of people who had spent years being professionally cautious about humans. No one who watched him do this was entirely sure whether it was accidental. The arguments during the 8 months of debate shifted in ways that the people making them did not always fully track. Species that had begun the session firmly against the repeal found themselves by the 4th month arguing for conditions rather than outright opposition. Species that had been neutral moved to quiet support. The Breath, who had more reason than anyone to oppose the motion, sent a message to the Senate that surprised everyone. They did not oppose it. Their message said, in the careful, formal language of a people who chose words with great precision, that in their experience it was better to know where humanity's strength was pointed than to hope that a document could redirect it. The vote came on a gray morning at the end of the 8th month, 61-7 in favor. The Human Accord was repealed. The Mutual Defense Partnership was ratified. Humanity became officially an in writing the galaxy's shield. In the human delegation gallery, Calvin Reyes did not stand up. He did not cheer. He sat in his chair with his notebook open on his knee and wrote something, while the chamber filled with the noise of a decision being made. His aide, Lucy, sitting beside him, glanced at the page. He showed it to her without being asked. It said, finally. She laughed. She had not expected to. It came out before she could decide whether it was appropriate, and then she decided it was, and she did not take it back. Pete Dawson, standing at the back of the gallery with a cup of coffee he had brought for himself for once, read the vote on the chamber display and nodded. Once slowly, the way someone nods when a thing they have been waiting for a long time finally happens, and they want to be sure they remember the exact feeling of the moment. In the weeks that followed, things did not change overnight. The galaxy did not become peaceful or simple. The work of the Defense Partnership was slow and complicated and involved a great deal of paperwork and negotiation, and the particular kind of patience required to build something real rather than just something that sounds good on paper. There were disagreements. There were difficult meetings. There was one session that lasted 14 hours and ended with Calvin and the Dolari ambassador eating cold food from the building service unit at 2:00 in the morning and agreeing quietly that they were both too tired to be enemies. But in the outer rim, in a system that the Senate's maps labeled with a number rather than a name, a Vreth colony had been under siege for 3 years. A rogue faction, well armed and without Senate affiliation, had been slowly tightening around the colony's perimeter. The Senate had discussed the situation 17 times. They had passed 3 resolutions expressing concern. The colony was still under siege. 46 days after the vote, the colony's communication officer picked up a signal on all frequencies. It was broadcasting in 17 languages, including Vreth, including the 4 most common dialects of the Outer Rim, including 2 languages spoken by species so small they had almost no presence in the Senate records. The message said, "Hold on. We are coming." The signal came from a fleet of human vessels crossing into the Outer Rim at a speed that should not have been possible for ships that size. The colony's communication officer stared at the readings for a moment. Then she patched the signal through to the colony's main speaker system so that everyone could hear it. The Vreth, who had named humanity's way of war the most terrifying thing they had ever encountered, heard that message. In the cold, in the siege, in the long months of waiting, and something moved through the colony that did not have a name in their language. In English, the closest word is relief. But there was something else underneath the relief, something older and simpler and harder to name. It was the feeling of knowing that you are not alone in the dark, that somewhere out there something strong and strange and relentless is moving in your direction, and it is moving that way because it chose to, because it considers you its own. The fleet came out of the dark between the stars, and it did not slow down, and it did not ask for anything, and the siege ended in 4 days. The galaxy had outlawed human warfare because no species could survive it. What the galaxy had not understood until now was that this was exactly the point.